Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today, we're heading straight into the heart of the Wrong Turn franchise. We're talking about One Eye.
Oh, interesting choice.
Right. I mean, those West Virginia woods, creepy enough on their own, but then you add this guy to the mix, and, yeah, gets pretty intense.
Definitely not a place you want to get lost.
Not at all. And that's what I think is so fascinating about One Eye. He embodies that unsettling feeling in such a visceral way.
Yeah.
You know, you look at him and you just know instinctively that this is not someone you want to cross paths with.
Absolutely. It's that immediate sense of danger he projects. And it's not just about his appearance either, although that definitely plays a huge role.
Oh, yeah, that single eye staring right at you. The deformities, the imposing physique. It's like pure visual horror. Plays on all those primal fears, you know? Disfigurement, things lurking in the shadows.
It's not subtle, that's for sure. It's in-your-face horror, designed to make you uncomfortable from the first moment you see him. He just oozes danger.
Exactly. It's like an immediate threat. But it's more than just the looks, right? It's how he moves, or rather, how he doesn't move. That silence, the brutal efficiency.
Oh, for sure. There's a terrifying intelligence to his hunting style. It's calculated, methodical, and absolutely ruthless.
Like he's always thinking, always one step ahead.
And that's what makes him so scary. He's not just a mindless brute. There's
Yeah.
a thought process there, strategy. He knows what he's doing.
And the way he uses his weapons, I mean, they're not fancy. Axes, knives, very basic tools.
Right, but in his hands, they become instruments of terror. It's about more than just brute force. It's the precision, the deliberate cruelty.
It's chilling. So let's talk about how this all plays out in the films.
Hmm.
The first Wrong Turn movie, he's one of the main antagonists, right?
Right out of the gate, he establishes himself as a major threat.
That scene where he's stalking the group through the woods, so simple, but so effective. The silence, the way he just blends into the environment. You know he's there, but you can't see him. Pure tension.
It's like watching a predator studying its prey. You know something bad is going to happen, but you don't know when or how. That anticipation is what makes it so terrifying.
Absolutely. And then in Wrong Turn 2, Dead End, we get even more insight into his, well, I guess you could say his personality, if you can call it that.
We see more of his brutality, that's for sure. And the family dynamic starts to come into play a bit more. There are hints at a backstory, which always adds another layer of intrigue.
Right. It makes you wonder, what happened to this guy? What events shaped him into the monster he became? We get some answers later on, but the mystery in those early films is part of what makes him so compelling.
Definitely. Wrong Turn 2 really ramps up the gore, too. I mean, the whole franchise is pretty intense,
Yeah.
but that one, particularly for One Eye, it cements his reputation. This guy's not messing around.
He's all business. Speaking of his family, that's something I find really fascinating. He's not a lone wolf, is he?
No, he's part of this really messed up family unit. Sawtooth, Three Finger, they operate as a pack.
And that's what makes them even scarier. Because now you're not just dealing with one crazed killer. You've got this whole group of them, all with their own twisted quirks and methods.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, what's the hierarchy there? Who's the leader? Is it a partnership? A rivalry? The films never explicitly spell it out, which just adds to the mystery and the unease.
Right, and we get these glimpses of their interactions, but it's never quite clear what the dynamic is. Are they a team? Is there a constant power struggle going on beneath the surface? It's something that keeps you guessing.
Yeah. It's fascinating, but also kind of unsettling. Like, you don't want to get too close to try and figure it out. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. It's like you can tell there's something going on there, but you don't want to stick around long enough to find out what it is.
That's a good way to put it. And then there's the bigger question of what they represent as a group. They're not just random monsters in the woods. They embody something deeper, something about the dark side of human nature.
Oh, absolutely. They're like a reflection of our fears about isolation, about what happens when people are pushed to the fringes of society. It's like they're a warning sign.
Like, be careful, this is what can happen if we don't pay attention to the cracks in our society. If we let people fall through the cracks, this is what they could become.
A powerful message, even if it's delivered in a pretty gruesome way.
Horror can do that, though, right? It can force us to confront uncomfortable truths.
So we've talked about One Eye's appearance, his cunning, his evolution within the series. But what really intrigues me is his role within this family dynamic. He's not just a solitary figure of terror. He exists within this complex and disturbing social structure.
Right, and it makes you question, how do those relationships form? What are the bonds that unite them? The films give us little hints, but there's so much left unexplored.
It's like we're seeing the tip of the iceberg. They communicate, they coordinate attacks, but there's this underlying tension, this unspoken language between them that's truly chilling.
It's like a puzzle you can't quite solve, and that just makes them even more effective as villains. Because it's not just the gore or the violence, it's that unsettling feeling that there's more going on beneath the surface, that there's this whole world of darkness we're just getting a glimpse of.
And that glimpse is enough to make you want to turn away,
Hmm.
but you can't. It's like a car crash, You don't want to look, but you can't help yourself.
It's that morbid curiosity. We're drawn to the things that scare us.
Exactly. And that feeling of unease that stays with you long after the credits roll.
It gets under your skin, and that's the mark of good horror, in my opinion. When it sticks with you, makes you think.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're going to keep doing in this deep dive. We'll be right back after a quick break.
It's like it plants a seed of doubt in your mind. Makes you question everything you thought you knew.
You start looking at the shadows differently, don't you?
You do. But, before we get too lost in the woods, I think it's worth circling back to One Eye specifically. I mean, we talked about his evolution, but there are some key moments in the series that really stand out.
Oh, yeah. Like in Wrong Turn 3.
Yeah.
Left for Dead. Remember that one?
Mm-hmm.
His role kind of starts to fade a bit. Three Finger takes over as the main attraction.
Right, yeah. That's a turning point in the franchise for sure. Some fans weren't thrilled about it, naturally. But it let the series, branch out, explore other characters, and, well, Wrong Turn 3 is also where
One Eye meets his end.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, not the most iconic horror death, maybe, but it definitely shifted things, opened up space for new villains, new stories.
And then, boom, we get Wrong Turn 4. Bloody Beginnings, the
Yeah.
prequel. And suddenly we're back in One Eye's early years, seeing him as a younger mutant?
Yeah. It's fascinating. He and his brothers escaping from that sanatorium, and even then as a kid, basically, you see those primal instincts. It's chilling.
It makes you wonder, right? Was he always going to be this way? Or was it like his environment, the stuff he went through?
Nature versus nurture. Always a big question in horror, isn't it? And with One Eye, I don't think there's a clear answer, which honestly makes him even more interesting. We see that brutal upbringing, but there's also this sense of, I don't know, shared trauma, a bond with his brothers that comes from, I guess, hardship.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so then we jump back to the present timeline, Wrong Turn 5, Bloodlines, One Eye is back, but more of a supporting role this time. What struck me there was the emphasis on the family, like their unity. They're not just individual killers anymore. It's more like they're this pack relying on each other.
Right. It's like a twisted form of, codependency. But scary as hell, obviously. They
Yeah.
communicate, strategize, they know each other's moves. It's effective.
Super effective.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, though, is there any actual affection there? Or is it purely about survival? Like, do they ever disagree? Argue about who gets to use the chainsaw first or something?
Right. I think there's room for both interpretations, honestly. We see moments of, cooperation, even a kind of messed up camaraderie. But there's also that underlying tension, like their relationships are always on a knife's edge, ready to snap.
Oh, yeah. Like a powder keg waiting for a spark. And then, of course, we have to talk about the 2021 reboot. Big changes, totally different storyline, new villains, and One Eye. Gone.
Yeah, a bold move, for sure. The reboot tries to tap into different themes, more modern anxieties, shows how horror evolves,
Totally. But it makes you think, why leave One Eye out? Was it just to distance themselves from the originals? Or did they think, like, his story had run its course?
I think it's probably a bit of both. The reboot, it's going for a different vibe. Maybe One Eye felt too connected to, the early 2000s horror style.
Maybe. Makes you wonder, though, do you think One Eye holds up as a horror villain? Like, compared to the big names, Freddy, Jason, those guys?
He may not have that level of, pop culture recognition, but he's effective. He represents a very specific type of horror and does it well.
He's a reminder that sometimes the most basic monster, driven by pure instinct, that can be the scariest. Doesn't need a complex backstory or superpowers. His presence is enough.
That's true. His design is iconic for sure. Like, those deformities, they play on our deepest fears. It's like a nightmare come to life.
And I think his silence plays a big part, too. Adds to the mystery. You never know what he's thinking, what he'll do next.
Definitely. It also makes him more animalistic, strips away any trace of humanity. He's just this cold, calculating predator.
And speaking of animalistic, it's interesting to compare him to Three Finger, right? Who, let's be honest, is probably the most recognizable of the bunch. The face of the franchise, you could say.
They're like two sides of the same coin. Three Finger, he's more flamboyant. The showman, Loves the theatricality of it all. One Eye, he's all business, efficient, ruthless.
Yeah, like he's the muscle behind the operation.
Hmm.
They make a hell of a team, though. A terrifying team.
And that dynamic, it just adds another layer to their scenes together. You can feel that tension between them, the push and pull of their personalities.
Okay, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the family dynamic. I know we've talked about the hierarchy and stuff,
Yeah.
but I'm curious about the psychology of it all. How did that shared trauma, the isolation, how did that shape their relationships? Do they actually care about each other, or is it just about survival?
It's a rabbit hole, isn't it? Trying to understand those twisted minds. Did they create their own, like, warped version of family? They rely on each other, protect each other, but there's always that threat of violence lurking beneath the surface.
It's like they're constantly walking on eggshells around each other, even if they don't always show it.
And that's what makes it so compelling. You never know if they'll turn on each other or if that bond is, unbreakable.
It keeps you guessing, that's for sure. And it reminds us that even in the darkest, most messed up corners of horror, there's complexity, nuance. These characters, they might be monsters, but they're still products of their environment, their experience.
Exactly. And that's what makes horror so fascinating. It lets us explore those darker sides of human nature in a safe way, of course.
Safe-ish. So as we wrap up our exploration of One Eye, I want to leave you with this thought. If they did another Wrong Turn reboot, a fresh start, would you bring One Eye back?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I mean, he's so tied to those early films, that whole gritty look. To do him justice, they'd need a really strong vision. Something that honors the original, but, adds something new to the mix.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It would be quite a challenge. What about like his relationships with his brothers? We see bits and pieces, but there's so much more they could explore there.
Imagine a film that really dives into those quieter moments. Like, what are they like when they're not out there, terrorizing people?
Right. Do they even have a sense of humor? Do they ever fight? Get jealous of each other?
It would definitely humanize them a bit, wouldn't it? Maybe
Yeah,
too much.
maybe. But it would be fascinating. I mean, we talk about One Eye's brutality, his cunning, but who knows? Maybe underneath all that, there's some vulnerability there.
Vulnerability. Wow, that's an interesting thought. I'm not sure about tenderness, but yeah. Seeing those more, complex emotions, that would definitely change how we see them.
It all circles back to what makes a horror villain memorable, right? For
Yeah.
me, One Eye, he's just pure visual horror. That primal fear of something hunting you relentlessly.
He proves you don't need fancy backstories or, magic powers to be scary. Sometimes the simplest monsters are the most effective.
It's that silence, the blank stare, the way he
Uh,
just keeps coming, taps into something deep,
Yeah.
like that fear of the unknown, of something that just acts on pure instinct.
And in a way, it reflects our own, darker impulses. That survival instinct, the potential for violence that's in all of us. It's like a reminder that the line between what's civilized and savage, it's thinner than we think.
Chilling stuff. But that's what good horror does, right? It sticks with you. Makes
Mhm.
you think about the things you'd rather not.
Absolutely. And One Eye, even with limited screen time, he does that really well.
He does. He's all about suggestion,
Hmm.
creating terror with like minimal dialogue. It's all atmosphere, visual cues.
Less is more sometimes,
Yeah.
especially in horror.
Well said. So, as you head back out into the world, maybe take a quick glance over your shoulder just in case. You never know.
And remember, sometimes the best horror is the kind that leaves you with more questions than answers.
And the scariest monsters. They're often the ones that show us a little bit of ourselves, the parts we'd rather keep hidden.
Ooh, that's a good one to end on.
Right. So that wraps up our deep dive into One Eye. We've talked about his look, his cunning, his complicated family life, and his impact on the Wrong Turn franchise. Big thanks to our expert for joining us. What do you think, listeners? Is One Eye a villain worth remembering? Let us know. And until next time, stay curious and keep exploring those dark corners of the world. You never know what you might find.